The first thing Rhea Callas did when Commander Dresch walked into the bunker was laugh at him. Not a polite laugh, not the kind you swallow behind your hand when something mildly inappropriate catches you off guard. She laughed the way you laugh when a man shows up to a river crossing in a paper boat, open-mouthed, head back, the kind of laugh that turned every face in the room toward her because nobody laughed like that anymore. Not in the underground, not 6 months after the Vethara came. "You're the backup," she said, wiping her eye with the back of her wrist. "They sent us a supply runner." Dresch stood in the entry arch of Sublevel 4, the old railway maintenance hub the survivors had turned into a staging ground, and said nothing. He was a compact man, 52 years old, with the kind of stillness that comes not from composure but from long practice at not reacting. He had a burn scar running from his left jaw to his collarbone. His jacket had no insignia. He was carrying a duffel bag and a field tin he'd clearly been eating from, and he smelled like 3 days of tunnel travel. "Myra Ortega sent you," Rhea pressed. She was standing in front of the tactical board, marker in hand, surrounded by 12 people who all stopped what they were doing the moment she started laughing. "The Myra Ortega who has maybe 9 people fit to fight between here and Hold Point 7, and she's sending us a supply runner." "Reconnaissance specialist," Dresch said. He set the duffel down. He opened the field tin, saw it was empty, closed it again. "Same thing," Rhea turned back to the board. "There's a cot near the generator. Don't touch anything marked red." The room went back to its business. Slowly. A few people exchanged glances. Tobias, the youngest of them at 19, opened his mouth, and Lena, their medic, a woman of quiet economies, touched his arm and he closed it again. Dresch found the cot. He sat on it. He did not touch anything marked red. The Vethara had come without warning, which was both true and false depending on how you measured warning. False because the signals had been there, pulse anomalies in the upper ionosphere, migratory pattern disruptions in cetaceans worldwide, a 6-month period of electromagnetic interference that every government on Earth had classified quietly and then classified louder, and then stopped talking about entirely. The data existed. It had been collected, filed, and buried under 17 layers of interagency non-disclosure. True because no preparation had been made. No preparation could be made, really, for what came out of the sky over every major population center simultaneously. Ships the size of football stadiums, bronze-black and faintly luminescent, hovering at 15,000 feet like the world's most patient threat. No attack, no communication, just presence. 3 weeks of that, of armies pointing missiles upward, and politicians arguing about trigger authority and ordinary people looking at the sky, while grocery store shelves went empty. Then the Vethara came down. Not the ships stayed. The Vethara themselves descended, tall, bilaterally asymmetrical beings with 4 long limbs arranged in opposing pairs, mottled gray-green integument that shifted color slightly in ambient light, and no visible eyes in the human sense. They located their sensory organs along ridges that ran from the crown of the skull down the spine. They saw in thermal, in electromagnetic frequency, in chemical gradient. They processed everything. They missed nothing. Except humans, specifically the way humans moved through tunnels. The Vethara were evolved for open terrain, wide savannas of their homeworld, flat and sun-bleached, where distance was everything, and the smallest movement betrayed location. They had conquered their world's apex predators by outsensing them at range. They had crossed interstellar space by outplanning everything they'd ever encountered. They had never met a species that went underground by instinct, that turned claustrophobic darkness into advantage, that built weapons in maintenance shafts by lantern light and called it Tuesday. The first 8 months of occupation had killed approximately 60% of humanity's above-ground population. The next 4 months had killed most of those who tried to flee. The survivors were, with very few exceptions, people who had gone deep and stayed there. Rhea Callas was one of them. She had been a xenobiologist before the Vethara arrived, not the kind who hunted creatures in the field, but the kind who sat in labs and argued about evolutionary frameworks with colleagues over bad coffee. She'd had a particular theory about convergent development that most of her peers considered interesting but unverifiable, which was the academic equivalent of being laughed at politely. She had a small office at the Institute of Astrobiology in Geneva, a decent publication record, and a habit of staying too late because her apartment was small and the lab had better light. Her theory, stated simply, was that any species advanced enough to cross interstellar space would have solved certain problems in roughly the same way, because certain problems have a limited number of viable solutions: locomotion, energy acquisition, social organization, threat response. You could vary the substrate, carbon or silicon or something with no earthly analog, but the functional pressures remained constant, and functional pressure was what drove evolution everywhere it operated. She had argued this at conferences and in papers and over bad coffee, and had mostly been told that it was interesting but unprovable, which she took to mean that nobody had yet given her data to prove it with. The Vethara gave her data, more data than she'd ever wanted. She spent her first 3 months underground cataloging everything she could observe indirectly: vibration patterns, chemical trace, the geometry of their patrols, and building a picture of a species that had, in fact, solved certain problems in recognizable ways. They had a threat hierarchy. They had infrastructure logic. They had hardwired safety protocols that overrode higher-order decision-making under specific conditions, just as human biology overrode rational thought under physical threat. Understanding them did not make her feel better. It made her feel capable, which was different and more useful. When the signals started appearing in the ionosphere, she had been one of 17 people on Earth who correctly identified what they were. She had written a paper. The paper had been classified within 48 hours of submission. She had been brought to a government facility in northern France and asked to sign documents, and then asked to stay. She'd been there when the ships appeared. She'd been there when the Vethara came down. She'd been the one, standing in the facility's observation room beside 3 generals and a deputy secretary of defense, who said, "Their sensory ridge is chemoreceptive. They're tracking us by metabolic signature. We need to go underground, seal the entry points, and stop cooking food above the soil line." The generals had looked at the deputy secretary. The deputy secretary had looked at Rhea. Then they'd all looked back out the observation window at the bronze-black shapes, descending through cloud cover like slow metal gods. "Thank you, Dr. Callas," one of the generals had said. "We'll take that under advisement." She'd gone underground the next morning, alone. Dresch slept for 14 hours straight, which told Rhea something she filed away without comment. When he woke, he spent an hour looking at the tactical board without touching it. He had the quality of attention that she associated with people who processed before they spoke, not slowness, but discipline. She noticed him clocking the entry points she'd marked, the patrol rotations indicated by color-coded arrows, the zones she'd shaded in 3 different hatching patterns to indicate Vethara density. "What's the red hatching mean?" he asked. "Dead zones. Vethara have established permanent sensory posts. Any movement above ground in a red zone will be tagged within 90 seconds. And the crosshatch? Transitional. They move through but don't station. Window of approximately 4 to 7 minutes between passes." Dresch nodded. He looked at the map for another 30 seconds. "Your north corridor isn't marked." Rhea turned from where she was working. "What?" He pointed. "Tunnel system running northeast from this position. It's not marked red, it's not marked crosshatch, it's not marked anything. You either haven't scouted it or you know something about it that you're not putting on the board." The room was quiet again. Tobias was doing it again, that thing where he watched Rhea to see how she'd react, like a kid watching a lit fuse. "It's not on the board," Rhea said. because it dead ends at what used to be the old rail junction. The junction is flooded. The flooding is recent, probably Vethara-related, though we haven't confirmed the mechanism. Anyone who goes down that corridor drowns or turns back. How deep is the flooding? We don't know. We haven't gone far enough to measure. Dresh looked at the tunnel line on the board a moment longer. The junction would be directly beneath the east support pillar of the Vethara's surface installation. The room stayed quiet. Rhea felt something shift in her chest, not alarm exactly, not even surprise, more like recognition. The specific feeling of watching someone pick up a thread you thought was invisible. Yes, she said. Then the flooding is intentional. They pumped groundwater to seal that approach. Possibly. Not possibly. He turned from the board to look at her directly. They know about that corridor. They sealed it on purpose, which means if we can unseal it, we get direct subsurface access to their primary installation. Rhea's voice was flat. Yes, I worked that out 4 months ago. I've also worked out that swimming through a flooded tunnel system in the dark, past whatever they installed to enforce the flooding, with no way to know what the water table looks like on the other side, that's not reconnaissance. That's a way to produce corpses. So you need a plan. I need equipment I don't have, personnel I can't spare, and approximately 3 days of quiet that I'm also not going to get. She looked at him steadily. What I have is 12 people, 18 days of food, and a supply runner from Hold Point 7. The correction didn't land the way corrections usually did. Dresh just returned her look without heat, the way an old dog absorbs weather, and said, "Reconnaissance specialist." Tobias made a sound. Lena's hand moved toward his arm. He was quicker this time and bit it back himself. The Vethara's apex hunters came on the 3rd day. There were 4 of them, which was 3 more than anyone wanted to see. Regular Vethara soldiers were bad enough, 7 feet tall, armored in secondary growth carapace that functioned like organic plate, moving with the particular efficiency of something that had never been prey. Apex hunters were a different order entirely. They were to ordinary Vethara what raptors were to pigeons, the same general architecture, refined by evolutionary pressure into something that existed only to find and end things. They moved in total silence. They tracked chemical trails through sealed rock. They had never, in any documented encounter, been driven back by human resistance. The survivors in Sublevel 4 knew this, because they had a radio. The radio still picked up fragments of transmission from other underground communities, dwindling in number, sporadic in signal, but enough to build a picture. The Apex Hunters had been deployed twice before in their sector. Both times, the communities they were sent after had gone silent within 48 hours. The first sign was the sound, a vibration more than a sound, a low harmonic that came through the floor, through the soles of your feet, through your back teeth if you pressed them together. It was the Vethara's long-range chemical broadcast, the pheromone equivalent of a bloodhound picking up a scent. Rhea had spent 4 months learning to read these signals. When she felt it, she was at the board with a stylus, adjusting the patrol rotation, and she stopped moving so suddenly that Lena looked up from across the room. "Everyone stop what you're doing," Rhea said in the voice she used for this. Not loud, completely flat. "Reduce metabolic output, slow your breathing. Anyone who's running warm, lie down, press your back against stone. Now." People obeyed. They'd learned to. The vibration intensified over the next 20 minutes. Then it shifted, not louder, but directional, coming now from the northeast, from the corridor that dead-ended at the flooded junction. Rhea looked at Dresh. He was already looking at the board. "They know about that corridor," he said, quietly, not an accusation. Just a man confirming a theory he'd rather be wrong about. "They know about this position," Rhea said with the same flatness. "The corridor is how they're arriving. They pumped the water out." "How long?" She closed her eyes, running the geometry. The corridor is approximately 300 meters, at apex hunter movement speed based on reported encounter timings 22 minutes, maybe 25. Can we run? She opened her eyes. North exit is 2 minutes travel, south exit is 4, east is blocked by a collapse we haven't cleared. West exit, the one that goes toward the surface, is 8 minutes, but it puts us above ground in a crosshatch zone with a 6-minute window. Vethara pass through on a standard sweep rotation. If we time it wrong by 90 seconds in either direction, we come out into a patrol. So we can't run. We can. Running is an option. She looked at him steadily. I said the west exit puts us in a crosshatch zone. I didn't say it was impassable. Something passed across Dresh's face. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than hope. The expression of a man who has been in enough bad situations to know that the difference between dying and not dying is often one good question asked at the right moment. What's the other option? He said. Rhea picked up the stylus, turned back to the board. We go to them, she said. It took her 3 minutes to lay it out. She was good at brevity when it mattered. The flooding in the northeast corridor wasn't gone. It had been reduced. The Vethara had drained enough to create a passage for themselves, not to eliminate the water entirely, which meant the corridor was still partially flooded, which meant the chemical suppression that gave water its masking properties was still partially in effect, which meant that if a human crawled through that passage, cold, wet, metabolically suppressed by low temperature, they would arrive at the eastern junction with a significantly reduced chemical signature. The junction itself was directly below the Vethara installation's primary heat regulation system. She had spent 4 months mapping the vibration patterns that came through the floor, and 3 of those months suspecting that what she was mapping was the thermal waste cycle of something enormous directly above. A power core. An atmospheric processor, something that the Vethara needed to maintain a fixed position to operate. Something they were protecting. If you breach the regulation system, she said, you don't hurt them, you don't kill anything. What you do is trigger an emergency thermal shutdown protocol. Every Vethara installation has one, it's hardwired into their systems, same way smoke detectors are hardwired into buildings. A thermal event above a certain threshold trips a full system lockdown. Every unit in the proximity gets pulled back to defensive positions around the installation. She let that sit. Including the apex hunters currently coming down our corridor, Tobias said slowly, like he was tasting the words. Including them, Rhea said. They don't retreat because they're afraid of us. They retreat because their protocol overrides their hunt. Their apex predators evolved for open terrain, and their installation system is designed around that mass concentration of forces when the primary asset is threatened. They pull everything in. And when they pull everything in, Dresh said, the surrounding tunnels are empty. For approximately 6 hours, that's the documented duration of a thermal lockdown event based on the 2 incidents we've had radio contact about. 6 hours of clear tunnels, clear crosshatch zones, clear above-ground approaches in the dark in the right direction. She pointed at the board, at a spot 40 kilometers north of their position. The location everyone who had been in these tunnels for months knew by its shorthand. Hold Point 11, the deep shelter, Myra Ortega's people and 60 others and food reserves for a year. The room was quiet, with the kind of quiet that has weight. Someone has to go down the corridor, Lena said, into the water. Yes. And breach the regulation system. Yes, Rhea paused. I've spent 4 months mapping the vibration patterns. I know what to cut and where to cut it. I know the corridor geometry. I know the junction layout from pre-invasion municipal infrastructure records that I've had memorized since month 2. She looked around the room. I'm going. Tobias opened his mouth. This time Lena didn't stop him. You're going alone. I need someone at the north exit to get the group moving the moment the hunters pull back. I need someone at the west exit to monitor the sweep rotation and call the timing. I need Lena to be ready to move the injured fast. I need everyone else positioned to run. She looked at them. Which leaves me. Dresh said, I'll go with you. You're a supply runner. Reconnaissance specialist. He held her gaze. You said you know the layout. You don't know what they've installed in the junction. You've been mapping from vibrations through rock. I've been inside 3 active Vethara installations. The room got very still again. When, Rhea said. Before I came here, he didn't elaborate. He just looked at her with that same quality of patience, the burned scar along his jaw catching the lantern light. I know what their heat regulation interfaces look like. I know where the manual override access points are. I know what tools don't work on them and what does. He paused. You need me in that corridor more than you need me at an exit. Rhea looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the map. The north corridor unmarked, the thread she'd thought was invisible, the question asked at the right moment. Fine, she said. We leave in 8 minutes. The rest of you know your positions. She turned away from the board, and if the expression that crossed her face in those 2 seconds before she composed it again was something no one else would have called an apology, only someone who'd spent months reading the silences between people in tight quarters would have caught it. Lena caught it, she said nothing. The water was cold in the way that stops being unpleasant and becomes simply a physical fact, like gravity. Rhea and Dresh went in at the knee-deep mark and were waist-deep within 30 meters. The corridor was low, maybe 2 meters of clearance, dropping as it descended. They moved with their faces low, breathing through their noses, the kind of breathing you do when you are trying to have as little body as possible. Dresh had produced, from the duffel that Rhea had dismissed as the standard gear of a supply runner, a set of tools she didn't have names for. Compact, dull-finished, made of some composite material that didn't ring on contact. He'd carried them wrapped in a cloth that smelled faintly of something she recognized from lab days, a chemical suppressant. Same class as what she'd been using to mask metabolic signature. Better grade. She did not say anything about this. The harmonic of the apex hunters was audible now, not through the floor but through the water itself, conducted along the flooded tunnel like sound through a wire. They were getting close, which meant she and Dresh were getting close. They were converging from opposite ends of the same corridor, moving toward the junction that was the midpoint. And the question, the one she did not say out loud, because there was no point in saying it out loud, was which party would arrive first. She went faster, not recklessly, but faster. Dresh matched her pace without commentary. The junction announced itself by the cold getting worse. A significant inflow of groundwater was still occurring somewhere above. The Vethara's drainage hadn't eliminated it, just channeled it. The junction room was chest-deep, and it was large enough that the ceiling vaulted upward 8 or 10 meters, old concrete construction from the 1960s, the kind of municipal infrastructure that was built to last and mostly had. Light came from above. Not daylight, the installation's ambient illumination, bleeding through gaps in the floor plates above, bronze-tinted, warm. And there it was. Not what she'd expected. She'd built a mental model from vibration signatures and municipal schematics, and the mental model was approximately right in topology and completely wrong in scale. The heat regulation system wasn't a pipe junction. It was a column, a dense, slowly rotating assembly of Vethara biomechanical material that descended from the floor of the installation above through a sealed port in the ceiling, down into the water, where the water itself was acting as a coolant medium. It pulsed faintly. It generated the harmonics she'd been feeling through the floor for months. She stared at it. Dresh was already moving through the chest-deep water toward it. The manual override, he said quietly, is typically located at the base assembly, below the rotation coupling. There's an access membrane. It looks like part of the structure, but it responds to precise pressure in the right sequence. He was feeling along the base of the column as he spoke. 3 points counterclockwise, sustained pressure for a 4 count. "How do you know that?" she said. "I've had months to learn things too." He found something, pressed, counterclockwise 1. She moved to him. "What were you doing before Myra Ortega sent you?" 2. Dresh. "I was in the installation." His voice was very even. "Not this one, the one in Toulouse. I was inside for 31 days. "That's not," she stopped, recalibrated. "That's not possible. Nobody survives inside." 3. He pressed harder. "They're not infallible. They have gaps. They have a very specific gap around what a lone human female looks like to their thermal sensor array, because their heat recognition algorithm was calibrated on group signatures, and it has a documented blind spot for single female metabolic profiles in the 70 to 85 kilo range." He paused. "You're 81 kilos. She stopped again. "They can't see you the same way they see the others," Dresh said. "Not clearly. There's a half-second processing lag when you're the only thermal signature in a room. I documented it in Toulouse. I brought the documentation to Myra Ortega. She sent me to you because you're the only person in our sector who was going to understand what to do with it." He pressed the 3rd point. 4. The column stopped rotating. For 2 seconds nothing happened. Then the pulse changed from the low, steady harmonic she'd been measuring for months to something that climbed fast and sharp, an ascending tone that she felt in her chest, in her teeth, in the water vibrating around her waist. An alarm. A thermal cascade warning. The failsafe triggering exactly the way she'd calculated it would trigger. Above them, the installation's floor plates began vibrating. Movement. Mass movement. The heavy thud of Vethara units in coordinated locomotion, pulling toward the threatened center. And behind them, in the corridor, the harmonic of the apex hunters shifted. She turned to look down the corridor from which they'd come. The water was disturbed. Something large was displacing it at the corridor's far end, the heavy, deliberate movement of something that had been coming toward them and was now slowing, stopping. The harmonic that had been directional and purposeful became confused, overlapping, a frequency argument between the hunt drive and the override protocol. She had read enough Vethara behavioral data to recognize it. The hunters were receiving the emergency signal. They were being pulled back. They were stopping. In all the documented encounter records, in all the radio fragments and second-hand accounts that she had collected and cataloged and analyzed in the tunnels over months, she had never read an account of apex hunters stopping. The accounts were consistent in their terror and consistent in their brevity. The community heard the harmonic, the community went silent, the community did not come back on the radio. She had 63 data points of this. She had built the data points into a mental model of what the hunters were, and what they were was a threshold, a line past which outcome was fixed. Every strategic calculus she had worked out in the tunnels over 8 months had started from the assumption that engagement with an apex hunter was a losing proposition, not a hard one, not a costly one, a losing one. She had never planned around defeating them. She had planned around not being where they were. And now they were stopping. They stood in the chest-deep water of the junction, Rhea Callas, xenobiologist and Dresh, reconnaissance specialist, and watched the disturbance in the corridor water go still, then recede. The hunters were turning around. She felt the knowledge settle into her with the particular weight of something that is going to change how you think about everything that follows. Not triumph, not relief, something more precise, a revision, an update to a model that had been missing a variable. The Vethara apex hunters were not unstoppable. They were simply, in the conditions she had always previously encountered them, uncontested. Their protocol architecture had a seam. Their override hierarchy had a stronger pull than their hunt drive, and that meant they could be redirected if you could find the thing that triggered the redirect. She filed this under the same mental category where she kept everything she'd learned in the tunnels. Important, expensive, Worth what it cost to get it. They got back to sublevel 4 in 11 minutes. Tobias was at the north exit with his hand already on the release bar, and the look on his face when he saw them was the look of someone who has prepared himself for bad news for 20 minutes and doesn't immediately know what to do with good. "They're retreating," Rhea said. "North corridor now in this order." She gave the order, nobody argued. She'd had them ready for this, ready in the way that prepared groups are ready, not scrambling but flowing, each person knowing where they stood in the sequence. Lena went by and briefly touched Rhea's arm. Not a squeeze, just a flat hand, 2 seconds and then gone. Dresh fell in beside her as they moved. "You should have told me," Rhea said, "at the start. You wouldn't have listened." She considered disputing this. She was honest enough not to. "The blind spot," she said. "The single female thermal profile. You brought that to Myra Ortega. She could have told me before she sent you. She wanted to see if you'd still function with incomplete information." He was keeping pace easily, the duffel back on his shoulder, the field tin back in his hand. "She said you had a habit of assuming you'd already figured out the most important part." Rhea looked straight ahead. "She's not wrong." "No. And I laughed at you." "You did." They walked in silence for a few paces. Around them, the group was moving well, no panic, controlled pace, the tunnel walls close and familiar now after months. "For what it's worth," she said, "I only laugh when I'm afraid." Dresh considered this. "I know," he said, "I noticed." They emerged at the west exit into a crosshatch zone that was, exactly as Rhea had calculated, empty of Vethara patrols. The window was 6 minutes. They were above ground and moving toward the tree line in under 2. The night was cold and moonless, which was its own kind of luck. The Vethara's thermal vision was calibrated for comparative contrast, and on a cold night, warm-blooded humans were more visible, not less. Except for one of them. Rhea moved at the front of the group, through undergrowth, through a dry creek bed, through a section of rusted chain-link fence that someone had cut at some point in the past year and never repaired. She moved with the specific unhurriedness of someone who has spent months calibrating exactly how fast a human body can travel without spiking their thermal output. She kept her breathing level. She kept her heart rate where she could feel it, just below the threshold where fear becomes physiologically legible. Behind her, 12 people who had chosen to trust her in the absence of any better option did exactly what she told them to do. They didn't bunch. They didn't rush. They moved in a staggered line through the darkness, and none of them spoke. Dresh walked at the rear. His job in the position she'd assigned was to close the gap, to be the last set of eyes behind them. He did it without comment. At the 4-minute mark, they crossed a crumbled highway overpass and descended the far side into a gully that went north. The gully was deep enough to provide thermal cover. The earth walls reduced their profile from any aerial sensor above. From here, the route to Hold Point 11 was a 30-kilometer traverse, but it was a traverse through terrain she had been planning for 4 months, and the Vethara's emergency lockdown had bought them 6 hours. She stopped at the gully entrance and turned, counted heads, 12 faces, pale in the dark, looking at her with the expression that people in survival situations develop for the person who is, in that moment, the plan. She thought about the look on the apex hunter's trail, the disturbance in the water going still, then receding. Creatures that had never backed away from anything in any account she'd ever read, moving in a direction that wasn't toward prey because their protocol told them to. She thought about the column in the junction, and the base assembly, and 3 points counterclockwise, and a man who had spent 31 days inside a Vethara installation doing the slow, unremarkable work of learning things that nobody else was going to learn any other way. 30 kilometers, she said. We move in silence, staggered formation, my pace. Anyone who needs to rest, you signal me, 2 taps on the person in front of you, the tap moves forward. We do not stop for more than 3 minutes at a time. Questions. Nobody asked a question. Good. They moved. The traverse took 9 hours. Longer than the theoretical, because theory didn't account for the section of the gully that had collapsed, which added 40 minutes, or for the moment at the 2-hour mark when a Vithara aerial unit passed high overhead, and everyone dropped and pressed themselves to the earth for 8 minutes while Rhea watched the thermal display of something enormous blocking stars until it moved on. Or for Tobias, at the 5-hour mark, who turned his ankle in the dark on a piece of rubble and didn't make a sound. Rhea only knew because the 2-tap signal came forward from the back of the line, and she stopped, and Lena moved back, and 40 seconds later the line started moving again, and Tobias was in the middle now, one hand on the shoulder of the person in front, walking carefully but walking. She didn't ask, Lena had it. At the 7-hour mark, they crossed into what had been a municipal park on the city's northern fringe, now thoroughly overgrown, and she picked up the trail markers she'd placed herself 2 months earlier when she'd last been able to get this far north. Small scratches on specific rocks, a bent metal stake at a trail junction, a splash of particular mud that looked like nothing and told her everything about how far they had to go. 4 kilometers. She let herself feel it for exactly 1 step, the thing that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood. Then she moved it out of the way because 4 kilometers was still 4 kilometers, and the ground didn't know you were tired. Hold Point 11 was below a water treatment facility that had been decommissioned in 2019 and not demolished in time to matter. The entry was through a maintenance access point in a concrete bunker that looked like nothing, locked, featureless, the kind of infrastructure feature that the eye moves past. Rhea knew the entry sequence because she had been there in the 8th month and had spent 2 days with Mayra Ortega going over maps and protocols and arguing about whether a push north was viable. Ortega had said it wasn't. Rhea had said it would be, given the right conditions and the right timing and one more piece of information she didn't yet have. She pressed the entry sequence. The hatch opened from the inside. Mayra Ortega was standing at the bottom of the access ladder. She was a small woman, 60s, with silver hair she kept short and a prosthetic left hand from an event 3 months before the Vithara arrived that she'd never explained to anyone. She had the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself, the kind that is simply present the way mass is present. You feel it before you consciously identify it. She looked up at Rhea, then past her, counting heads as they came down the ladder. Then she saw Dresh, who was last, and her expression shifted in a way that was small but visible. Well, she said. Yes, Dresh said. Both of you, she said. Yes, Rhea said. Ortega looked at Rhea for a moment with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite admiration, but was, again, something that lived in the neighborhood of both. I told him not to explain everything right away, she said. I wanted to see how far you'd get. I got everyone out. You did. With help I didn't ask for because I didn't know it was necessary, because you withheld the one piece of information that would have changed my entire approach from the beginning. Yes, Ortega held her gaze, and Rhea breathed out through her nose. The tunnel air down here was different from sublevel 4, warmer, more occupied, the smell of more people, more cooking, more life concentrated in rock and concrete. It smelled like survival in quantities she hadn't smelled in months. And the blind spot, she said, the single female thermal profile, what else does it do? Ortega's mouth moved. If it was a smile, it was the compressed kind, the kind that happens to people who have spent a long time not allowing themselves more. Come in, she said. There are 63 people who are going to want to see the group that made it from sublevel 4, and then you and I have a great deal to talk about. The inside of Hold Point 11 smelled like 63 people living in good faith, food, humidity, the particular warmth of compressed bodies, the alkaline undertone of long-burned candles and repurposed industrial lighting. Rhea had forgotten what that smell felt like. Sublevel 4 at its most populated had held 14 people. The difference between 14 and 63 was not arithmetic. It was existential. 14 people could believe, on the harder days, that they might be all that was left. 63 people made that belief impossible, and she had not realized until this moment that she needed the belief to be impossible. She stood in the entry corridor and breathed it in and said nothing. Dresh stood beside her. The group from Sublevel 4 filed past them in the careful way of people entering a known safe space for the first time, tentative at the threshold. Then not. The body's threat assessment system standing down in sequence. They talked for 4 hours. Rhea talked, Ortega talked, Dresh talked in the particular economy of someone who has learned to say exactly as much as the situation requires and nothing else. The people of Holdpoint 11, 63 of them, ranging from a woman of 81 who had apparently walked here over 10 days from the south, to a pair of children, 7 and 9, who had been with Ortega since month 4, circulated through the space, went about their business, watched the newcomers with the particular interest of people to whom new arrivals are both hope and additional burden. Tobias sat with his ankle elevated and ate 3 things in rapid succession, and then fell asleep against a wall, which Lena apparently thought was medically acceptable because she let it happen. The blind spot, Ortega explained, was one of 3 systemic vulnerabilities that Dresh had documented in Toulouse. The others were more technical, more dependent on equipment they didn't yet have, and more relevant to what came next, which was not. Ortega was clear about this, simply surviving. Survival had been the first problem. The first problem was, if not solved, at least solved enough for now. The second problem was different. The second problem was the installations. There were 9 of them in the sector, 9 fixed installations on the surface, each one a hub for Vethara activity in its zone. As long as the installation stood, the Vethara had territory, infrastructure, and the ability to project force. As long as they had that, humanity was playing a defensive game with a shrinking board. The thermal lockdown protocol, Rhea said. Ortega looked at her. It pulls everything in. Every unit in the proximity concentrates on the installation. If you trigger it and the installation is simultaneously hit from another direction, she paused. You can't breach a Vethara installation from the outside. The carapace armor, the defensive systems, the... No, Ortega agreed. You can't breach it from the outside. A silence. Toulouse, Rhea said, 31 days. Dresh set down the cup he'd been holding. I had help, he said. Took me 9 days to get in. Took me another 3 weeks to map the interior before I had to leave. I didn't do anything while I was in there. I just learned. Could you get back in? It was not quite a question. He looked at her with the steadiness that she had initially read as the nothing expression of a man with nothing to say, and was now reading correctly as the deep-water calm of a man who has thought about hard things for a long time without flinching. Not that installation, he said. It's locked down. They know it was breached. They found the trace evidence after I left. A different one. Possibly. I have thermal maps of all 9 installations in the sector, Rhea said. Based on vibration analysis, surface observation from crosshatch window passes, and a dataset that's been growing for 8 months. I know the heat signatures. I know the approximate power cycles. I know, she stopped, reconsidered. I know part of what I need to know. And I know the rest, Dresh said. Ortega looked at both of them. Her prosthetic hand rested on the table flat, the way a hand rests when its owner is making a decision about something they've already actually decided. I've been waiting, she said, for both of you to arrive at the same problem from your respective directions. She looked at Rhea. You've been building the map for 8 months. She looked at Dresh. You've been building the internal knowledge. She looked at the table. Separately, neither of you can do what needs doing. And together, Rhea said. Together, Ortega said, you can walk into a Vethara installation that isn't expecting you, because one of you is invisible to their sensors, and the other one knows where to go once you're inside. She paused. Which is something no human being has ever done. The statement fell into the room's ambient noise, voices elsewhere, the distant hum of the facility's power generation, a child's laugh from somewhere down the corridor, and sat there, neither heavy nor light. Just true. I need 2 days, Rhea said. I need to look at his documentation from Toulouse against my maps. I need to identify the installation with the best entry approach given the blind spot parameters. You have 2 days, Ortega said. Rest first. Rhea opened her mouth. Ortega looked at her. Rest first, she said again, with the tone of someone who has been saying things twice for a long time. You walked 30 kilometers in 9 hours. The plan will still be there in 8 hours. So will the installations. Rhea was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the cup that someone had placed in front of her at some point in the conversation and which she had not yet touched, and she drank from it. It was broth, warm and slightly salty and thin but genuine, and it tasted like something she had been going a very long time without. Fine, she said. Dresh was already refilling his cup. His burned scar caught the overhead light the same way it had caught the lantern in sublevel 4, and he looked, she thought, the way a man looks when he has carried a very specific purpose for a very long time and can feel it coming within reach. Not excitement. Something quieter. The particular quality of someone whose preparation is about to become action. She recognized it because she felt it in herself. On the morning of the second day, before the others were fully awake, Rhea spread her maps on the table in the main planning space, and Dresh spread his documentation beside it, and they began the work of finding where the 2 datasets fit together. It took 3 hours. It was not easy. Her vibration maps were inference-heavy, built from indirect evidence, and his internal layouts from Toulouse couldn't be assumed to translate exactly to a different installation. But the core architecture was consistent across installations. Vethara built with biological logic, not modular logic. Their structures grew according to function, following the same developmental patterns the way bones follow the same patterns, which meant the key systems occupied predictable spatial relationships to each other regardless of site-specific variation. She found the installation she wanted at hour 2. It was the southernmost in their sector. She knew it best, had the most observation data on it, and its position relative to the tunnel system running below the old shipping district meant the approach was viable on the blind spot parameters Dresh had documented. A single woman, below the thermal detection threshold, moving through terrain that the installation sensor array covered in overlapping fields with one specific gap in the northwest approach that lasted approximately 4 minutes during the power cycle's minimum draw point. 4 minutes. 4 minutes to get from the northwest approach to the installation perimeter, Dresh said. He was looking at her map with the same quality of attention he'd brought to the board in sublevel 4. Then the perimeter is monitored differently. You know the perimeter systems. From the outside, no. From the inside, yes. He looked up. Once we're in, the internal sensor coverage has the same blind spot issue as the external field for your thermal profile. You can move through zones I can't, and I can move through zones that require knowing where to step. Literally, there are pressure-sensitive floor arrays in the secondary corridors. Show me. He showed her. She showed him. They worked in the kind of focused quiet that you reach when 2 people with different pieces of the same puzzle have stopped competing about the pieces and started building. At some point Lena appeared with food. At some other point Tobias appeared with questions that were mostly good ones. Ortega circulated through twice without stopping, which was her way of checking without interrupting. By noon they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It was the kind of plan that required specific conditions, specific timing, and a specific person, one specific person, going places that no human being had gone and coming back out. It was the kind of plan where the margin was thin and the consequences of error were total. It was, Rhea thought, the only plan they had, which meant it was also the best. "We go in 4 days," she said. "That gives Ortega 2 days to stage the secondary team at the thermal lockdown position, and gives me 48 hours to walk the northwest approach in the dark and time the sensor cycle precisely." She looked at Dresch. "You stay here. You don't walk that approach because you're visible." "Understood." "I'll be gone overnight, 2 nights." "Understood." She looked at the maps for a moment. At the installation's outline on her vibration data, the rough shape of something enormous that she'd been building a mental picture of for 8 months. Seeing it now overlaid against Dresch's interior documentation, feeling the shape of it suddenly complete in a way it hadn't been before. "I laughed at you," she said without preamble. He didn't look up from the documentation. "We've covered that." "I know." She paused. "I'm not apologizing again. I'm noting that I had information suggesting I should have been less dismissive, and I dismissed it anyway because the format it arrived in didn't match my expectations. You got everyone out." "Eventually, with help I didn't know I needed." She straightened up. "I'm making note of the mechanism so I don't repeat it." Dresch looked up then. He looked at her with an expression that was not warm exactly, because he wasn't built for warm the way some people are, but something genuine, the expression of someone who respects a specific kind of honesty. "Noted," he said. She walked the northwest approach on the first night and came back with the sensor cycle timing. She walked it again on the second night with a handheld vibration meter she'd modified from salvaged components, and came back with a map of the floor array positions in the first interior section, accurate to within 30 centimeters. On the third night she slept for 10 hours and let Lena check her ankle, which she had apparently been walking on wrong for 2 days without noticing. On the fourth morning they went. The northwest approach in daylight was a strip of industrial wasteland, cracked hardpan, the collapsed skeleton of a logistics warehouse, a stretch of perimeter fencing that had been partially dismantled at some point during the occupation for purposes she'd never been able to determine. At night it was something else, a 3-dimensional space of overlapping shadow and subsonic Vethara harmonic, the ground underfoot communicating information through the soles of her boots if she knew how to read it. She had spent 2 nights walking it, timing herself, measuring the sensor gaps with a count she could feel in her chest rather than in her head. The entry window was at 03:47 local time. The installation's power cycle hit minimum draw in a 4-minute window between 03:45 and 03:49, during which the northwest sensor array dropped below effective detection threshold. For someone whose thermal profile was already at the edge of the array's recognition bandwidth, for a woman of 81 kilos moving alone through cold air at controlled metabolic rate, that window was not just an opening. It was an invitation. She had not felt anything like this since before the Vethara arrived. Not fear exactly, fear she'd had plenty of. This was older and different. The specific alertness of someone who has been studying something for a long time and is about to find out if they were right. A scientist's feeling. She had nearly forgotten she was one. They moved at 03:40, 7 minutes to the perimeter. There is a particular quality to the inside of a Vethara installation that no description adequately captures, because the frame of reference for all human architecture is human scale, and the Vethara build for their own scale and their own sensory world, which means walking inside one feels less like walking inside a building and more like walking inside a living thing. The walls are not flat. The corridors are not straight. The light comes from surfaces rather than points, warm and omnidirectional, the specific tint of a sun that Rhea knew from her xenobiology training, from the spectral analysis of Vethara skin coloration, was approximately a K2 star, orangish and old. They were bathed, here in their own installation, in the light of home. She moved through it invisibly. Dresch moved behind her in the shadow of her thermal profile, stepping exactly where she stepped when the floor array was active and moving to the documented safe channels when it wasn't. They did not speak. They communicated with a system of finger signals they had worked out over 2 days and practiced until the signals were automatic. The primary atmospheric processing core was 14 minutes inside the perimeter. They knew this because Toulouse had put it 14 minutes inside the perimeter, and because Rhea's vibration map had placed a major heat source 14 minutes inside this installation's northwest approach, and because sometimes 2 data points from different directions align with enough precision that you trust them. They were right. The core was enormous, a chamber that rose 40 meters, filled with the slow movement of Vethara biomechanical systems cycling at the deep rhythm she'd been reading through rock for months, now vast and immediate and close enough to touch. The harmonic was no longer a floor sensation. It was the air itself. She stood at the entry to the chamber and looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. She had promised herself 3 seconds, because she was a scientist and scientists do not stand inside functioning alien power cores without at least 3 seconds to observe, regardless of circumstances. Then she turned to Dresch and made the signal, ready. He moved to the access panel they'd identified from his Toulouse documentation, confirmed its position against the map, and began the sequence. It was more complex than the junction column, 7 steps rather than 3, involving a tool she still had no name for, and a moment in the middle where he stopped and held perfectly still for 4 seconds that felt much longer, because the Vethara unit that was servicing something in the chamber's upper reaches had just turned, and was turning back, and its movement had the quality of something about to focus. Dresch did not move. Rhea did not move. The Vethara unit turned back to its work. Dresch completed step 4. Step 5, 6, 7. The core's harmonic changed. Not like the junction column, not an ascending alarm tone. This was deeper, slower, the kind of sound that travels through the body rather than the ears, a resonance failure. A cascade initiated at the system level, not the safety level. This wasn't a thermal alarm. This was the core itself beginning to misfire, the biomechanical equivalent of cardiac arrhythmia, something the system couldn't interpret as a perimeter threat and therefore couldn't trigger the lockdown protocol on. That was the other layer of the plan. The secondary team outside, Ortega's people at the positions Rhea had marked, not attacking. They couldn't attack a Vethara installation from the outside. What they could do was make noise, above-ground noise at the sensor perimeter in a pattern that matched the thermal and chemical signature of an organized assault. A fake assault, a distraction, something the Vethara's outside units would respond to. Combined with a resonance failure in the core. Combined with the thermal lockdown protocol that the installation's safety system would interpret the external disturbance as requiring. 3 things at once, pulling the Vethara's decision architecture in 3 conflicting directions simultaneously, none of which left room for investigate the interior for a possible internal saboteur, because the interior was where the safety system was telling them to concentrate, and the interior was simultaneously experiencing a failure condition, and the exterior was simultaneously experiencing an assault threat, and the Vethara, who were extraordinarily capable in open terrain against single clear threats, were not evolved for 3 simultaneous ambiguous threats in 3 directions from inside a structure. They were, Rhea had theorized, going to have a very bad several minutes. She found out she was right when the installation began to shake. Not physically, the structure held, but the harmonic shifted in 3 different directions at once, and the light changed, and from somewhere above she could hear the specific sound of mass Vethara movement that was no longer coordinated movement that was responding to competing signals, units pulling toward the perimeter, and then back toward the core, and then toward the external threat, overlapping, crossing, the alien equivalent of an organization whose communications have just stopped making consistent sense. Now, Dresch said quietly. They went out the same way they came in. 14 minutes. Northwest approach. The 4-minute sensor window. And then open ground and trees and the dark. Hold point 11 heard the installation from 30 kilometers away. A low, continuous tone, felt more than heard, that lasted for 40 minutes and then stopped. Not because it was repaired, because the cascade had completed. The installation in the shipping district went dark. In the weeks that followed, the sensor data from the surrounding tunnel network showed something that had not been observed since the first days of occupation, the Vethara contracting, units pulling back toward the remaining installations, the territory around the dark installation becoming something it hadn't been in over a year, empty. Not free, not safe exactly, but empty, and empty was something humanity could work with if humanity had spent enough time learning how. In the weeks that followed the dark installation, people came. Not many at first, a group of 7 from a drainage tunnel complex to the east, then a family of 4 who had been living in a basement for 11 months, then a cluster of 15 who had been moving between locations for so long that when Ortega's scouts found them, they initially refused to believe Hold Point 11 was real. The population of the shelter doubled in 3 weeks. The food reserves became a genuine concern. Ortega handled it with the same prosthetic hand flat-on-table decisiveness she applied to everything, and Rhea found herself sitting in planning sessions that were no longer just about survival, but about logistics, about organization, about the specific practical problems of a community that was beginning, cautiously, to believe it had a future. She wasn't used to future planning. She'd been living in the present tense for so long that future felt like a foreign language. She could feel herself relearning it, word by word, and the feeling was odd and not entirely comfortable, like a limb coming back from cold. Dresch moved through Hold Point 11 with the same quality he brought to everything, deliberately, observantly, occupying only as much space as necessary. He ran equipment checks. He trained 3 people in the use of the tools he carried. He ate without comment and slept without ceremony and was, she observed, quietly liked by almost everyone within the first week, which she found both unsurprising and faintly irritating in a way she examined and concluded was her own issue. He had also, she noted, been right about the supply runner thing. He was not a supply runner. He was very much not a supply runner. She mentioned this once briefly, and he said, "I know," and that was the entire conversation. Myra Ortega put it simply, the way she put things that mattered most. 8 installations left, she said, and now we know something we didn't know before. Rhea was at the planning table. Dresch was across from her. Between them were maps and documentation, and the accumulated knowledge of 8 months of underground survival and 31 days inside an alien installation, and a dataset that had started as a xenobiologist's theoretical framework and was becoming something that looked, in the right light, like strategy. 8 installations, Rhea said, and the same vulnerabilities in all of them. And the same blind spot. Yes. Ortega looked at both of them, the compressed almost smile. How long? Rhea looked at the maps. 8 installations. Each one a hub of Vethara power and territory, each one built to the same biological logic she now understood better than she had any right to. Each one with a northwest sensor array that hit minimum draw in the same power cycle window, because the Vethara built consistently, because consistent solutions to consistent problems was what her convergent development theory had always predicted, because the data she had been collecting in the dark for 8 months was not just survival mapping. It was science. It had always been science. She looked at the map of the sector and saw not 8 fixed threats but 8 problems with known structures and a known method of solution, and the method required 2 things, her and the man sitting across from her. She looked at Dresch. He looked back at her with the steadiness that she had stopped misreading months ago, the steadiness of preparation meeting purpose. The burned scar on his jaw, the empty field tin, the tools with no names that had come out of a supply runner's duffel bag because nobody who was actually a supply runner carried tools like that. She thought, I laughed at you. And you came in anyway, and you sat on that cot, and you watched the board, and you waited for me to be wrong about the important thing. She thought, that's a patience I want on my side for as long as this takes. Ask me again in 4 days, she said. She picked up the stylus. She began to plan.